Thank you, Michael. So, there's a certain burden on the local planner to make sure that I get across to you in just a few minutes all the great stuff that Vancouver's doing. And I certainly feel that pressure, but I'm going to duck that pressure a little bit because I know you're going to hear and see a lot of that in the next few days. And instead, I'm going to focus a little bit in my few minutes here about how we think about the future, and particularly with regard to a renewable city strategy and related elements in our Greenest City Action Plan. So with that little bit of indulgence, let me go to the first. When Michael called all of us and contacted us, he said, we want to hear about the future. We got to do some future casting here. What's it going to look like in Vancouver in 2030 or 2050? And it started me on a thought process, actually, that didn't lead to a series of images about exactly what it was going to look like, but instead to how we think about the future. And so the normal way we would approach this kind of thing is to be predictive, right? And that's a somewhat passive activity, except that at least we can observe a very, very powerful dynamic at work in society, which has been at work for thousands of years, probably this interrelationship between technological advancement and economic and societal development, right? So like the two strains in the double helix, they are very much interwoven. And periodically there's a big burst in one industrial revolution or another. And clearly energy and green technologies are really coming into that strain in a big way. But I'm not sure that's enough. So we as city builders want to take a slightly different path, which is, but what is our intention about the future? We don't have a lot of time to waste. How do we actually visualize that future and maybe go on a slightly different way? So maybe that is the part of the connective tissue between the two strains here, which is not technology, it's not even economic modeling or questions of governance, but really all of those things and more. Where do we want to end up? And how do we integrate that tough question that was posed by Jose about how do we make sure that all this technology and economic robustness is actually serving community? So in a way, what the first path leads you to is incremental change. You're sort of at the effect of those other dynamic forces, and you're hoping to make change by increment, and that's all good. Some of this may seem simple to you, by the way, but I think it's easy to forget the obvious when we're in our day-to-day work. I would say the other leads to the possibility of transformative change, and that's kind of the takeaway message that I want to leave you with. And that involves innovation and bold moves, for one, and this is the first step. So here's one that's not really related to energy per se, but at least something where New York engaged a bunch of design teams and said, what does the future look like post-Hurricane Sandy? And probably a lot of you have seen this image before. This is actually removing or acknowledging that it's likely that probably the most valuable real estate in North America will be gone. And so do we build a tall wall and try to hold the sea at bay for as long as we can, or do we do something else to reconceive our shoreline? So that sort of powerful thinking about physical transformation is really, excuse me here, important. Here's one from Vancouver, which is probably true in many of your cities, is the advance of electric vehicles. And this is a step change that could be seen really as incremental change. To me, what the transformative part about this is the notion that this is car share, not just electric car. So the idea that particularly the generation of millennials now doesn't really want to own a car, doesn't want to drive except when they have to, not have a hulking piece of steel or two in every single garage in town, but actually use a car when they want to, opens up all kinds of possibilities, not only for reduction of GHG and travel, but opens up the landscape of pavement in the city and of parking structures for all kinds of other uses. So the notion of leveraging one aim against another and getting out more of it is really important. In Vancouver, we're also going big time just now in the last year or two into the Passivhaus technology, including for the first time, I think we're seeing some applications for high rises in downtown Vancouver. Something not thought about just a few years ago. This is a 100% rental project. It's under construction now. It will be near net zero, not quite, but has all kinds of concomitant health benefits as well because they've really figured out the air circulations and so forth. We think this will become the standard of building in a very, very short time in Vancouver. It has about a 3% cost premium. So we're rolling a lot of this up into a renewable city strategy, or have been, and will be. This goes through 2020, so we've got to renew that renewable city strategy very, very quickly. It does set some pretty aggressive goals, which match what we heard from the other speakers. But I wanted to say that that alone is not good enough to be a collection of incremental best efforts, but actually to use the opportunity for the renewal of that strategy and our larger Greenest City Action Plan to actually engage in backcasting, which sounds kind of nice, a little picture of the future, and then, okay, how many steps do we need to take to get there? No, that's just a series of incrementalism. What this is really about is being actually quite rigorous about opening up everything in the box to see how do we actually get to that desired future, whether that is technology, governance, economic modeling, community involvement, whatever it takes to get there. And that's rarely done, and I think something that behooves Vancouver now in taking its next step. I'm just about there. So again, we want to be the greenest city in the world by 2020. That was an aspiration we had a few years ago. What does it take to really factor that up for the next few years? The one thing I would say here is that we're not alone, and we have friends here, I think, from other cities in Cascadia. This is, in my view, a potential for huge learning. Just as this is a global conference, we are really one bioregion, and with a lot of cities that really want to lean into that intentional future edge. And so I would put that there. The one thing I would say is that in rethinking the next step is really renewable and net zero the standard, right? And so we are very focused on this 2050 date and hope to meet it sooner. You know, all of our plans are aiming to that, which would be great. We're no longer depleting resources of the earth. But you know, for the last 100 years, we've been digging ourselves a very big hole. So what does going past that actually look like? How do we actually give back? And so there are a lot of people thinking in this space now, and what it needs to do is really find its way into our discipline of backcasting and of process. And it may actually enable us to get to that 2050 net zero sooner than if we didn't contemplate those kinds of things. So I'm just going to zip through these. This is actually work done in Portland by a man named Gil Kelley, no relation, at the ZGF firm there, who's really been thinking about above ground, below ground infrastructure and how we complement energy savings through a whole bunch of concomitant efforts by really looking through an urban design and infrastructure and investment lens. You should contact him if you don't know him. Really, really interesting work going on, both in the US and in Japan, where he's been doing a lot of work, again, with the idea of serving community as well as serving the energy reduction needs. So, thank you.